Um, little bit about myself, first of all, then. So, my name is Dr. Timothy Birtles. I graduated from Southampton in February last year with my PhD. Um, I have also run a lifelong learning course before. So, last year I ran a Schopenhauer and Nietzsche online course, which was really popular and really successful. And so, this is my second rodeo, if you will. And I'm trying to keep things fresh. It's a way of allowing me to learn more about my subject as well. So I've gone into a different area this time, and I want to offer a course on existentialism because I think it's incredibly interesting. So we're just going to have a little introduction now to some of the ideas and the themes and the main concerns of the existentialists. Um, and then I'll introduce some questions that we may be asking throughout the course as well. So, I completed a PhD at Southampton, so this is on the University Institutional Repository. Still getting used to being called a doctor. Um, my research was on Arthur Schopenhauer, who's kind of a proto-existentialist, so one of the first figures. He wouldn't necessarily, in fact, he didn't know what existentialism was. Existentialism is an invented term in the 1930s in France. But my area of expertise is in sort of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and early existentialism. And this is the course that I ran last time as well, which was on Schopenhauer and on Nietzsche. And if there are any people who are interested in this course, then I'm more than happy to run this course again as well in the future. Okay, so a rough sort of plan of what we'd be looking at in this course is here. So roughly 6 weeks. Um, week one, sort of the origins of existentialism, looking at Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, some of the Russian authors as well. Week two, looking at Heidegger. Week three and week four, focusing on Sartre. And that's important because he really is the celebrity, the big guy in existentialism. And then week five and week six, looking at Camus. So, in many ways, this is a philosophy lecture series, but it's also a history of ideas, which is the area of philosophy that I'm interested in. So, how do ideas develop? How do they grow? What's the cultural background that leads to their growth? Now, these two books, just one second, I'm just gonna get my water. These two books are incredibly dense, and if you want to get turned off existentialism, buy these and try and read them. Like most philosophers, they tend to write not as well as they imagine. Um, so these are very dense. If you feel confident, being in time and being in nothingness are kind of the Bibles, the Old and the New Testament for existentialism. However, there are loads of easier books as well. This is a fantastic book, Kevin Aho, Introduction to Existentialism. This is a book that came out a few years ago. So at the Existentialist Cafe, Heidegger's Being in Time. One of the good advantages of existentialism is that because of its philosophical commitments, many existentialists don't feel the need to write in ordinary prose. And so there are many existentialist novelists as well. So there's a bit of sort of literary criticism here. Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus, they both wrote novels primarily. So Les Nausées or Nausea is a good place to start. This is a good introduction to Sartre, as is his letters on humanism. And then finally, Camus, some really good short sort of novellas by Camus. But if you wanted to buy one book, I would suggest this one on the left, Existentialism, second edition. Okay, so a quick overview of the structure then. So I've introduced myself. I've introduced why I'm interested in this. Um, I want us to consider, first of all, the foundations of existentialism. So its origins and its cultural hinterland. And by that, I mean that it was a term, or is a term, that emerges in the 1930s in France, in Paris in particular. So most quote unquote existentialist philosophers don't and never have understood or known or even heard the word existentialism. So it's in many ways it's a posthumous label that's attached to these philosophers. So that's what we'll look at first of all. And then I'll give a brief examination of Sartre's thought only because Sartre is considered so pivotal. And then finally, some questions that we'll be asking during the course, and then any questions for me. Okay, so really, in my opinion, in order to understand existentialism, you have to go back to the Greeks. You have to go back to Aristotle in particular, because the existentialists were in complete opposition to the way that philosophy had been done for the last 2,000 years, particularly through Christianity, but also through the ancient Greeks and also through the medieval period as well. And that's because most of European thoughts, big generalization, but most of European thought is based on this idea called essentialism. And essentialism is the idea that everything has a nature, right? So Aristotle would say water's nature is to be wet. Um, the chair's nature is to be sat on. And Aristotle illustrates this in terms of causation, so the four causes. The fourth and final cause for Aristotle is telos or purpose. So there's a lot of big words here, but it's not too difficult to understand, really. The idea is simply that for 2,000 years, there's been a purpose to life. Okay, and that's come through ancient Greek thinking with essentialists like Aristotle, but also Christianity. And existentialism rejects that. So the old adage was for Aristotle and people like this, essence precedes existence. Now, what that means is before you're born, there is a human purpose, a human nature that you should be fulfilling. Okay. Before you make a chair, for instance, there's an idea in the carpenter's mind of what a chair is, chairness, right? To be sat on. It has a nature. Essence precedes existence. So before you exist, there's a human nature that's preceding. We might even say DNA today. And this means that we have objective values. We have right, wrong, good, and bad because it's objectively bad to kill somebody if human nature is the desire to strive for life. Okay, that's something that Thomas Aquinas would say. Um, Similarly, lots of essentialists get into all sorts of problems. The Catholic Church is deeply essentialist. It is human nature to reproduce. It's human nature to be heterosexual, right? Um, and therefore, you can start ascribing normative ethical claims, right? So it is a less ideal lifestyle being homosexual than being heterosexual is something that the church has said in the past, right? And that's because there's a human essence, there's a human nature. And this infused Christianity. So I've already mentioned Thomas Aquinas, but Aquinas takes these Aristotelian ideas and combines them with his understanding of Christianity. So what we have here is Michelangelo painting in the Sistine Chapel. It's a Christian idea, right? God has a idea of what it is to be a human and creates us in his image in order that we may achieve that idea. So we're striving to become better humans according to our nature, which is God given. So 2,000 years of human thought, this idea, which is called essentialism, um, has filtered into everything. Okay, so the best way I think of explaining existentialism is to use the adage that Sartre himself uses. So, essentialism, if I go back, is the idea that essence precedes existence. Existentialism is the idea that existence precedes essence. Now, if this was a proper lesson, I would pause here and ask people to ask, to tell me what you think that means. But obviously, we don't have time, so I'll tell you. This is the idea that for Sartre and other existentialists, we're born first, and then we invent who we are. There is no inbuilt human nature. We are radically free at all times to create, to recreate, to destroy what it is to be human. There is no human nature. We are radically free. So Sartre says this: what do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. So this is the reason it's called existentialism, because the idea is that the only given is that we exist. What we exist for, or why, what the purpose of our existence is there any purpose to our existence? Is suicide better than living? Is joining the army better than helping your mother? All of these questions are not, they're not baked into human nature. We're not going to find them by examining human nature because humans are radically free and we're free to define who we are at all points. Okay, so the first few weeks of the course, what we'd be doing is we'd be starting really with Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, because really they kickstart existentialism. Largely it's geographical, they're German. And existentialism, even though it becomes this popularized sort of French cigarette smoking in a cafe kind of aesthetic, existentialism begins in Germany. And I would argue, being biased, that it begins properly with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer wasn't an existentialist because he thought we do have a human nature, but what Schopenhauer was an atheist. So he rejects God. There is no greater meaning to our lives. And in philosophy, we call this, Schopenhauer's pessimism. This is a big quote. I've given the slides to the course conveners, and they can send them out afterwards. Um, I'm not going to read all of it, but there are some interesting bits here, so I'll read what's in yellow. So Schopenhauer describes humans as awoken to life from the night of unconsciousness. The will finds itself as an individual in a world without end or limit, among countless individuals who are all striving, suffering, going astray, and hurries back to the old unconsciousness as if through a bad dream. No possible worldly satisfaction could be enough to quiet its longing. Everything in life proclaims that earthly happiness is ordained to be in vain or recognized as an illusion. So, not a particularly cheerful outlook, but the reason that existentialism really begins with Schopenhauer is Schopenhauer is the first one really to admit that maybe life isn't what we think it is. Maybe we should be asking these deep, searching, meaningful questions about happiness, about how we can be happy if we can be happy, and whether a life of suffering is worth living. Lots of people are quite afraid of these questions, but I think they're really important. Okay, so from Schopenhauer, we then move in the course through to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was devout Schopenhauerian until he wasn't, and this is another important sort of pivotal landmark in existentialist history. So Nietzsche declares that God is dead. What he means by this is that the belief in God is no longer tenable. And what he means by God is objective values. So Nietzsche is known as a nihilist sometimes. He actually wasn't. But nihilism is the view that there's no values in the world. The world is a valueless place. We impose values onto the world. So that sounds quite complex and philosophical, but again, it's not. It's just the idea that, if you see someone doing something terrible, there is nothing terrible that's in the act. There's only your perception and your projected morality through which you are perceiving it as terrible. So Nietzsche is quite a scary figure because he seems to be undermining all of um, our sense of grounding in any form of morality. Um, and it's worth noting, and we'll note this in the course as well, that there is a strong connection between the existentialists, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and National Socialism in Germany. So one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, were these people sort of irresponsible? If we can define what we are and we don't have to follow any objective morality, then does that lead to Auschwitz? And lots of philosophers have argued that. So we must come to understand that God is dead, more than just the belief or disbelief in a God. Instead, the whole world is destabilized. All our values, Christian values, compassion, order, comprehensibility, even science, is up for question. And Nietzsche illustrates this and his response to it very famously in his parable, I suppose you call it, of the eternal recurrence. We don't have time to read through this, but as I said, it's on the slides. So Nietzsche is essentially saying, can life be affirmed? If a demon were to tell you that you would have to live this life exactly the same way over and over and over again into infinity, would you want to? Um, and this is also linked to a Greek myth called the myth of Sisyphus. And it's also the title of one of Camus' books. So the myth of Sisyphus is a Greek myth about a man who's rolling a boulder up a hill, and then he lets it roll down again, and then he has to roll it back up, and this continues in perpetuity. And for Schopenhauer would say no, there's no point existing, right? This is painful. Nietzsche is actually quite positive in the sense that he says that we ought to embrace our suffering, we ought to embrace this lack of value and overcome it and become Übermensch, become supermen. Okay, so far that's two atheist existentialists. There's also Christian existentialism as well. So Kierkegaard, so a Danish philosopher, you might think, oh, it's a bit weird. How could you be an existentialist but also be Christian? Because Christians believe in objective values that you're born with. Christians believe in human nature, right? To be made in the image of God. But Kierkegaard rejected this. So he argued that our nature, the world meaning is much more in doubt. Um, and God is essentially un approachable. You can't really approach God rationally or reasonably, and you can't really ever rationally or reasonably arrive at a purpose for life. All you can do is take a leap of faith, a leap of faith into the unknown. And you have to really define your own values and your own beliefs and your own meaning. It can't simply come all packaged up from a priest or in the Bible. So Kierkegaard was a Christian existentialist, so it's not necessarily the case that all existentialists, hated Christianity. And we see it emerging in Russian literature as well. So Turgenev, it's the first time that the term nihilism is ever mentioned. So it's in his novel Fathers and Sons. And he says a nihilist is a man who doesn't acknowledge any authorities, he doesn't accept a single principle on faith, no matter how much that principle may be surrounded by respect. So nihilism isn't quite the same as existentialism. I'll go to my definition here. Nihilism is the idea that nothing means anything. There's no objective meaning in the world. Now, existentialism is very similar. Existentialists are going to argue that yes, there is no baked in inner meaning behind our lives or the world at large. Um, but this doesn't mean that there is no meaning. It's just that the meaning has to come from us. So existentialism is my best definition of it. It's the belief that we are each responsible for creating purpose or meaning in our own lives. Our individual purpose and meaning is not given to us by gods, by governments, by teachers, or by any other authorities. And as I said, this term was coined in the 1930s, but wasn't really known until Gabriel Marcel. We also have Dostoevsky as well. So Brothers Karamazov and Notes from the Underground are both very existentialist novels. So if you've got a lot of time on your hands, these are great novels to read. Obviously, they never mention the word existentialism, but they're part of the lineage because they inspired the philosophers who later called themselves existentialists. Okay, so quick summary of what we've looked at so far. I'll try and talk a little bit about Sartre as well, but I don't want to overrun. Um, so existentialism isn't a fixed term or even a movement, to be honest. And this is what's even more interesting. Most existentialists didn't call themselves existentialist, and that's for one of two reasons. One reason is because they lived before the term was invented, And the other reason is even those who did live with the term refused to be captured just with the term, which is very existentialist. So there's a deep paradox there, right? If you call me an existentialist, you are defining me. And the whole point of existentialism is that you define yourself. So there's a real irony in calling someone an existentialist, and most existentialists, including Sartre, didn't like the term. So it's much more of an intellectual mood, um, like an umbrella term for a variety of different positions. But the mood generally is a lack of trust or a complete lack of faith in gaining any sort of sense of meaning from the world. Um, and it's not a coincidence, that this movement emerged in the 1940s. So I said that existentialism began in Germany, and in many ways it fed into, through Nietzsche, it fed into Hitler's warped ideas. Hitler thought he understood Nietzsche, he really didn't. Um, but also, the French writers, so Marcel and Sartre and Camus, they were fighting on the other side of the war. So it's quite interesting. Heidegger, who is the other big figure after Sartre, Heidegger was a Nazi. Jean-Paul Sartre was in the French liberation, French underground army in Paris. And it's not a coincidence that these issues come up after the Holocaust. Um, what meaning is there to a world that something like the Holocaust can happen in? Okay, so what unites all of these thinkers is a commitment to the view that individual human subjects are the loci for meaning. Meaning can't be given from without. Existence precedes essence. And it begins, the main thrust of existentialism as it is a movement, more in the 20th century, begins with Husserl and phenomenology, which is very complex. But in our first session, we can talk about that and go into some depth as well. Okay, I'm just going to pause very quickly just to ask Alison. I've only got 4 minutes left. Is the other speaker, is he lined up? Because if he is, I won't do the next bit. If he isn't, then I can.
I think both things are true, but keep going.
Okie dokie. Right. Please just tell me when to stop talking, because I'll just keep talking.
I
Okay, so
think keep going. We want to hear this bit.
okay, good, brilliant. So Sartre then being a nothingness, he talks of the structures of consciousness. Now, the reason that Sartre is so important is because he's considered sort of the rock star of existentialism, and because of this book that he wrote, so being a nothingness. But uh, this is what he argues. He analyzes the structures of consciousness, reveals two ontologically primitive types of being. Ontology just means being, right? So there are two kinds of being. In French, there's être en soi, forgive my pronunciation, and then être en soi. So être, oh sorry, this is the first one, the second one, sorry, to say être pour soi. Okay, Pour. So being in itself and being for itself. So most things in the world, like my bottle or the radiator behind me, they are beings in themselves. They're just things, and they don't have any what philosophers call intentionality. That means they're not about anything else, right? A bottle is just a bottle. It's not thinking about other things. It's not concerned with other things. And Sartre says most of the world is like this, except for humans. So we are kind of weird because we're not just objects, but our minds also project into the world. We have desires about things. We have thoughts about things. We have resolutions about things. Um, and Sartre says that at the heart of human en soi being for itself, at the heart of our nature is a nothingness. When I was studying this at university, I found this quite hard, but it's actually really easy because all these philosophies are straightforward if you just understand what the key argument. And the key argument that Sartre is making is that a human being can always say, no to anything. So I can have a choice between two different kinds of dinner that I'll have later. Um, that choice is only a choice because I can negate what I don't want. I can also say no to myself, and this is where existentialism gets scary. If you're a recovering drug addict, you can't control whether you'll have a drug in a week or not. You can't, because the person that emerges in a week's time is free. You can make 100 promises. You can swear on your life that you won't touch the booze. But at the heart of your essence, your being, is the ability at every single point in your existence to negate any resolution or any promise or any attitude or any existence that you had previously, right? So Sartre calls this sort of radical freedom, really. So being for themselves, our consciousness has no being. No, we have no nature. So what Sartre has a really interesting idea about this. What he means is that consciousness can't exist unless it's consciousness about something. So right now I'm looking at this bottle, and my vision, my being is wrapped up in this bottle as I see it. It's impossible for me to have a thought or even a feeling that's not about something else. Okay, and that's contentious. Um, but this is what Sartre argues. So nothingness is not a being, but a kind of shadow we project into the world. And because of this, we're radically free. There's no human essence. And to be conscious, for example, of a tree is to be conscious that one is not the tree. That's what it means to be conscious, is to look at things and say, I am that which is beholding the object. I am not the object itself. So what is it that's behind the object when it's being beheld by consciousness? And Sartre says it's a nothingness. There's a lack. Okay. When we behold ourselves, we behold a being who we are free to negate and not be anymore. This is complete existential freedom. But it also comes with anguish. So anguish is deep awareness of this freedom. I've felt this many times, and you might have as well. There's a very famous existentialist adage that says that vertigo isn't the fear of falling, it's the fear of jumping. And you might have felt, I think it's fairly common, but when you're in a really high balcony or a high building, you look down, you're in what's called existential anguish if this is happening to you. You're aware that you don't want to jump, but you're also aware that you have no control over yourself in 5 minutes. The person that you are in 5 minutes could negate any decision that you make now. And that leaves us in anguish because we're radically free at all points. So what do we do? What path do we follow? How do we discover meaning? This is expressed well in Vertigo, which Sartre says is not fear of falling, but fear of jumping. Now, obviously, there is limitations to my freedom. I'm not totally free in the sense I can't fly, right? I can't grow wings and fly. But I think Sartre has an understanding of freedom as what philosophers would call negative freedom, which is so long as I have at least two choices, I'm free. And there's never a point where you don't have at least two choices. You could disagree with that, but Sartre, would say not. So we're condemned to freedom. And he argues that some people don't embrace this freedom. Some people are so scared of this freedom that they pretend to be objects. Okay, now it's very obvious to see this in some industries, right? Like so prostitution is a good one, right? You're selling your body as an object. But Sartre gives the example of a waiter. So he observes this waiter in a French cafe who seems to be acting as though he weren't free. He wasn't free. He was acting as though he's mechanized. Um, and Sartre says that this is living in bad faith. So you can't live, or you shouldn't live, or it's not a good thing to live in denial of your existential freedom. And this is the last slide on Sartre. So we can also ask this question: can existentialism tell us how to act? So Sartre thought and so did Camus to a lesser extent. They fought the Nazis, um, even though they idolized Heidegger, and Heidegger was a Nazi. Um, and one of Sartre's students came up to him in his lecture theatre and said, "I've got a I've got a problem. I've got two choices to make. I either go and fight in a war and become a small part of a big noble thing, or my mother is very unwell and I go home and look after her. And if I go home and look after her, I'm a big part of a small thing. So shall I be a small part of a big thing or a big part of a small thing?" And he asks Sartre, he says, "What am I supposed to do? Like, I've got two duties here. One duty is to be a soldier, one duty is as a son." And Sartre says, "I can't tell you." He says, "You're free to choose. There is no script." Sartre says, "You'll know what the right choice is because it'll be the choice that you chose. It's the choosing of the choice that makes the choice authentic, it makes the choice, um, it makes it the right choice." So he says, "So you're free, so choose." In other words, invent. There's no general code of ethics can tell you what you ought to do. There are no signs in this world. Okay, good. So I'm going to finish just with some of the questions that we might be asking during the course. So this is the sort of thing that we'll be discussing. So how does Schopenhauer's concept of the will as a blind irrational force challenge Enlightenment ideas of reason and progress? That's a big part of existentialism. Existentialism eventually moves into postmodernism, um, which is an even darker sort of philosophy. There is no truth. Um, Kierkegaard. So can the leap of faith be reconciled with rational thought, or is existential belief inherently absurd? Nietzsche. What does Nietzsche mean by the death of God, and how does this concept reshape morality, meaning in the self? Heidegger. How does Heidegger's idea of being towards death redefine what it means to live authentically? Sartre. If existence precedes essence, does that mean we're entirely free, or does such freedom itself become a kind of burden? Camus. So what is the significance of the absurd for Camus? Why does Camus reject both nihilism and religious hope as responses to it? We can also have some comparative questions. So how do Kierkegaard's religious existentialism and Sartre's atheistic existentialism each address the problem of despair? Ethics in a world without objective meaning, how do existentialist thinkers propose we take moral responsibility for our actions? The last two questions, is Sartre's concept of bad faith still relevant in a world shaped by social media, identity politics, etc.? And finally, we can look at rebellion and resignation. So for Camus, revolt is the proper response to the absurd. And many of these existentialists were very highly political. Camus was involved in the Algerian uprising, um, Algerian revolution, and Sartre was involved in the French resistance and became a very vocal Marxist in the 1960s. We'll look at that as well. Whether existentialism is in any way compatible with Marxism, I don't think it is. Marxism is deeply essentialist. Um, Good, so that's me done. So look, it's an interesting course. I spent some time, a lot of time sort of reading and curating this, and we've tried to launch it a few times, but the numbers have been a little bit low. But hopefully there's enough people that we can talk about existentialism for 6 weeks. So thank you very much.